Good evening. Well, thanks for coming out on a Tuesday night to hear somebody talk about farming. It's kind of a interesting social activity for all of us this evening, I guess. And I'm just sort of curious, how many are gardeners out there at this point? Okay, all right. How many are farming currently? We got some, all right. How many are thinking about farming? And or staying in farming, I guess. Great, okay. Well, tonight we'll talk about, the first piece I'm going to talk about types of farming practices that fight climate change and their global potential, which is, to me, every bit in line with the things that Heifer's promoting around the world, Heifer's around the world. And then the second part, I've been asked to talk some about ideas for making a living doing this here, now, which is, good. I like people to make money at this as well. And I just wanted to say thanks to GCC for having us out. I really think that this is one of the most innovative programs in the country right now. And that's pretty exciting to me. And having been at this since 1989, I guess. That's very, when you couldn't learn this in college. And I'd also just like to say that I'm enough of a fan of Heifer that not only have I donated money to them myself, and not only have I gotten money from them for the farm that I used to run, but I married somebody who worked there. So I really am a super big fan. And among other things, they're doing some very nice work promoting useful trees, which I'm very excited about. Everybody gets, animals, which is great, but Heifer really has a very comprehensive vision of what's needed. From the animals, to the plants, to the training, to the infrastructure, like building dairy infrastructure so that farmers in East Africa can actually sell the milk. That suddenly they have enough milk to feed their family and they have more, but they can't get it to market. So they've helped to build that as well. I think they got a big chunk of money for that. From the Gates Foundation helped make that possible. It's very exciting. So what's my motivation for this? Well, I'll say that I've been interested in these kinds of permaculture type production systems, which again we'll kind of go into tonight, for a long time. But when I started really looking at climate change and seeing what was happening, and realizing what potential these practices have to actually do something about climate change, I got very enthusiastic. And I quit my job in 2009, and I've been really making this my sole focus, and I'm working my way towards a book about this. Some of you may have been part of helping to raise money for that. I had a really super successful Kickstarter campaign. It's all been very fun. So climate change is bad, I'll just say that. That's the slide on climate change, it's bad. And on the right there is the farm at Nuestras Raíces. That's just down in Holyoke. That's in the Connecticut River floodplain. Some of you may remember that incident 2 years ago very well. The issue is not that it's going to get a little bit warmer. That's not the problem. The problem is the increase in the frequency of intense weather events and erratic weather events. That's the problem. And for me, the motivation around climate change is not about polar bears. I really don't care about polar bears at all. I know you're not supposed to say that, but I care about people. I care about people, and I care about preventing the scenario where by 2050 there's 200 to 700 million refugees from climate disasters around the world. That's my motivation. I care about famine. I care about inundation of coastal areas. I care about massive areas of the world whose water comes from glaciers running out of water, like the Andes and Himalayas and stuff. These are things that really matter to me. I care about the end of the monsoon in India, which is a very realistic possibility. Those are the things that are motivating me. I love polar bears. I don't want to meet one up close, but I'm glad we have them. I love, rare tree frogs and stuff, but that's not my personal motivation. My personal motivation is really more out of a social care for people than an environmental one. So, and the roadmap is we need to bring the atmospheric parts per million of carbon dioxide back down to 350 or less. Less would be great. Back down to 300 would be great. 350 is what it would take to give us no more than 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Right now we're on track for 6, which is sort of a recipe for complete disaster. We're on track for 6 if we honor all the international agreements that have been made, which we're not on track to do it all. So, and to do that, we need to pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, a lot, 200 gigatons, 200 billion tons or more, which is a lot of carbon. And we need to cut emissions drastically. So we'll be talking tonight, the first part tonight, about how to do that through agriculture. And also, by the way, we need to completely redo our entire global civilization in order to meet this challenge. Which is, I just thought I'd mention that in one bullet point at least, that we really have to change the way we do everything we do, and that's a good challenge. And one strategy people are looking at for handling climate change are these types of strategies they call geoengineering, which are basically very expensive techno fixes that we may end up needing. They may be necessary. These are things like giant orbiting solar mirrors to deflect the sun's light away from the Earth, and a whole bunch of other things which basically sound kind of crazy, may be necessary, no one knows if they work. But they don't do anything to address, they're not really multifunctional strategies, you might say. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So, and one of the big issues in climate change is when you look at who's responsible for climate change, it's really the wealthy nations. We're the ones who've burnt the fossil fuels, and we're the ones in many ways who are responsible for much of the degradation of land, which is causing climate change. And yet, who is it affecting right now? It's affecting mostly poor people in poor countries. The kind of folks that Heifer works with the most are the ones who are being affected the most. And that injustice is what's led to the movement for climate justice, where we say, okay, any strategies we come up with to address climate change should also address climate justice. It only makes sense. It's only fair. So these are some friends of ours in Guatemala. This is Doña Corina and Don Victoriano, who are they're out laying contours, just like many of you saw on the tour. They're laying contours with an A-frame to put in some water harvesting earthworks and plantings on the contour of a hillside. And if you look behind them, that steep slope is covered in corn. And that's where people are farming in that region in Guatemala. And that's a huge cause of erosion. It's a cause of landslides when there are crazy unseasonal hurricanes or even seasonal hurricanes. And it's just a bad way to grow your food. It's not a sustainable way to grow your food. You're literally eroding the basis of your own survival. Right near this are beautiful floodplain, rich, fertile soils, which are owned by large companies which grow cantaloupes and send them here to the United States, and grapes. So it's a really nice microcosm of the whole problem in a certain way, this one little region of Guatemala. So we want strategies to address climate change that address these kinds of challenges as well. And I think we're talking about one. So carbon sequestration is really taking the carbon from the air and putting it somewhere where it's going to stay for a long time. And that could be in giant blocks that you bury under the ocean. It could be in wood that you use to build a building. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I like living plants and soil are my 2 favorite ways to sequester carbon. That's pretty much what we'll talk about for the rest of the night. And the way you want to do this is with perennial plants. Perennial plants are the best at sequestering carbon. If you look at the photo up there on your left are the roots of an annual wheat plant, the little tiny wimpy looking roots, and on the right are the roots of a perennial relative of wheat. If I asked you which one of those probably is doing a better job building soil and sequestering carbon, I bet you would pick the bigger one. The problem is the bigger one doesn't make much food yet. and we also need to eat. So there are people working on perennial grains, including perennial wheat, and we're maybe, well, right now we're just not funded enough to do it, but it's not really more than another 5 to 10 years of work to be there, which is very exciting. So we're sequestering carbon in the plants themselves, in the perennial plants themselves, but also in the soil. And it turns out, it's very exciting, that only a third of that carbon is above ground. So when you look at a forest or a grassland, the amount of biomass you see above ground, that's just how much leaves and branches and trunks and stuff is there, about half of that is carbon. But twice that much is underground. And most of that is in the organic matter in the soil. Some of it's in the living parts of the organic matter, some are in the dead parts, some are in the roots of the plants, but there's twice as much underground. And in a no-till system where you never turn over the soil, at least after you establish, you're banking a huge amount of carbon in the soil. It's quite exciting to me. And there are multiple examples of agroforestry systems and bamboo production systems that sequester more carbon than natural forests right next door. So there are scientifically documented examples, case studies, of types of farming with perennials that are better at sequestering carbon than nature, which is pretty fantastic. It's very encouraging. Now, they're not in this climate, but it is very, very exciting. And the more, they're long-lived systems, and they're systems that have a lot of trees are the ones that are meeting this criteria. And the International Panel on Climate Change is very, very excited about agroforestry, which is basically any system where you have trees involved in farming, whether they're trees with other perennials, trees with livestock, trees with annuals, or all of those things together, trees with aquaculture. Those are all types of agroforestry. So they've identified that there's as much land as twice the whole size of India that could be converted to agroforestry, which is a pretty good place to start. And given the range of tons per hectare that people are excited about these days in agroforestry, they're saying 40 to 260 tons per hectare based on a million variables that I won't bore you with. We could be looking at as much as 157 gigatons, or 3/4 of the amount of carbon that needs to be sequestered can be sequestered through tree-based farming systems. That's a really, really exciting piece of information. Now, transforming that much land, changing the way ornery farmers farm, that's not an easy thing to do, and there's a million economic challenges, which we'll take a little look at in the second part of tonight. But the potential is really there. Now, if we keep doing emissions at the rate we're doing them, there isn't enough land to sequester all that carbon. We have to stop the emissions. But the fact that we have the potential to sequester the emissions we've already made is a really big deal and very exciting, to me, very exciting. Now, agriculture is one of the parts of the problem. Agriculture as we practice it today. We're one of the leading causes of emissions. Some of those things come from shipping all of our food all around the world. That is not a great situation. Those melons that are being shipped from Guatemala, which are like 80% water, are being carried on big boats. They're burning up a ton of fossil fuel to get them here. That's not great. So our whole global food system, which involves shipping everything everywhere, is really the enemy of climate change. A few other things include that nitrogen fertilizers, conventional nitrogen fertilizers, they use a huge amount of energy to fix that nitrogen out of the air, to do what a bacteria can do naturally, or plants working with bacteria can do naturally. They're pulling a huge amount of that energy, is one of the worst contributors in agriculture. And then when it's overused, which it often is, the off-gassing nitrogen compounds are also intense greenhouse gases. So, and it kills mycorrhizae in the soil, which are one of the main carbon sequestering components of nitrogen fertilizers. That's Miracle-Gro, which I love dearly, but it's not the friend of climate change. I'll talk more about livestock later, but methane from ruminant livestock is not the friend of climate change. And there's sort of ways to raise livestock that sequester carbon and ways that really have a very negative balance. And confinement livestock has a very negative balance. It also doesn't make for happy animals mostly. And the last thing is tillage. Annual crops where you plow the soil every year, which I do at my house. And I ran a farm that raised vegetables for a number of years. Tillage is the enemy of carbon sequestration. And a great new review study just came out that looks at a whole bunch of scientific articles about this and really says fairly conclusively, look, tillage is just not the friend of carbon sequestration in the soil. It burns it up. It burns it up. That's very interesting. That doesn't mean that it's not good to have local annual grains and local annual vegetables, because it's reducing the emissions of shipping those things around the world. And often that impact is much more important numerically than the carbon sequestration. The first thing is to get it local and then to perennialize where we can, I think. And there's a number of other strategies, which I won't go through all of, but there's a lot of strategies that are excellent for reducing emissions from agriculture, although they don't sequester carbon. I'm a fan of them. I think people need to do them. I do lots of them, but I won't talk about them much more tonight. Like aquaponics, I think is really cool. So here's a slide that has a really this is from Guatemala again. We can see two really different kinds of food production systems, neither of which is perfect in this slide. On your left, well, let's say on your right first is an annual production system, which is empty mostly at the moment, but that's an annual field where there's tillage every year and there's annual crops being grown, which are for a local market, which is great, but it's not a carbon sequestering system. And on the other side, we see a tree-based system where there are nitrogen-fixing trees. They happen to be ice cream beans, which has a delicious fruit as well, growing over coffee. So that's a carbon sequestering system, which is great. But the coffee's being exported, which is not great. And coffee, I know many people feel like coffee is food, but actually it's really not the complete basis for a human diet. So really we'd like to see a fusion of these two things together where we're creating an actual human diet with multiple types of perennial plants and some intercropped annuals and livestock. So neither of these is perfect, but we're starting to get somewhere. So, and these kinds of perennial agricultural systems, which I'll talk about a bunch, I'll profile some of them, have lots of different multiple functions. And this is one of the principles of permaculture, is we want multifunctional approaches. We want a multifunctional agriculture that not only is sequestering carbon, but is capturing and infiltrating rainfall, is providing nutrition for people and income for people, is providing not just food but multiple different kinds of products, is fixing its own nitrogen and serving as its own windbreak or otherwise provide some agroecosystem services, helps the farm. That's able to stand up to crazy weather, that's resilient in the face of crazy weather, that's stabilizing slopes and controlling erosion, creates a beneficial microclimate. These are multiple positive impacts. And when you assess this kind of agriculture versus geoengineering, one of them is more multifunctional than the other. And also in terms of addressing climate justice, if we take our climate efforts and our climate dollars and we put them into these kinds of strategies, we're addressing social and ecological wrongs that have been around for a long time. If we put our efforts into geoengineering, we're really just making a couple of engineering companies a lot richer, which is not addressing these other issues at the same time. I don't want to sound cranky about it or anything. That's just kind of my perspective on these things. So having traveled some around the world and talked to a lot of folks who are farmers in different places, these things are important to me. So I want to look at a few of the practices. What are the types of farming that can sequester the carbon? And I'll break your hearts perhaps and say that in this climate, we have a long way to go in working out the practices and the species. However, we have more work being done than other climates, and our soils are some of the best at sequestering carbon in the world. So we've got some pro and some con here. We can't grow bananas and breadfruit just yet. We don't have delicious beans that grow on trees. Okay, we don't have any trees with edible trunks. We don't have any trees with edible milk, high protein, delicious, high protein, high calcium milk that comes out of any trees. We don't have that, but we have some very nice things. So in terms of practices, the first set I want to look at is where people are raising perennial crops with annuals together. And the easiest version of this that people like to talk about is called alley cropping, where you have rows of trees intercropped with rows of annuals. It's easy to think about if you're a farmer and you have rows of stuff. You just put a row of trees in every once in a while. And the big way you see this in the US is with black walnut intercropped with annuals. Because while you wait for those walnuts to get big enough to make walnuts and eventually to make timber, you can make some money in between them in the meantime with some annual crops. And there's nice budgets out there on this. This is a very well-established practice. In the tropics, typically those alley cropping systems use nitrogen-fixing trees to make fertilizer for the annual crops growing along with them, or to make fodder for livestock, and then the livestock manure is applied to the annual crops. And there's no reason you can't do that here. And there's been some nice studies in the southeast on what kinds of species you could use to do it, and they all grow here too. We can grow mimosa, and we can grow false indigo and these things here as well, including some native species we have that work very nicely for that. So that's the alley cropping, and when you do that on a hillside on the contour, it's called contour hedgerows, or the SALT system, sloping agricultural land technique, where on a hill you would have these contour rows of usually nitrogen-fixing woody plants that are cut down every year and laid down for mulch, and they basically serve as a living terrace. If you've ever put in a stone terrace on a hillside, you know it's not something to get very enthusiastic about. And when you can have plants do that job for you, it's really much easier, much faster work, and it's sequestering carbon instead of ruining your back and having ruined my back in part moving stone fences around, stone terraces around. That's near and dear to my heart. There's a bunch of other strategies that I'll maybe just go by and say there's a bunch of other cool stuff out there. There's some very, 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 very interesting practices. No-kill cropping is being developed in Australia, and it alternates warm season grasses, warm season perennial grasses that are reused for pasture with winter annual grains. So in the summer, you have a pasture, and in the winter, the same area you go through with a no-till plow, and you put in these little narrow furrows with winter grains like wheat and rye and barley. Very interesting. You could do the same here with a cool season pasture with summer grains like sorghum or soybeans for that matter. So very interesting. That's the no-kill cropping. And evergreen agriculture is this really lovely thing coming out of Central Africa where there are trees there that leaf out in the dry season that fix nitrogen, and then they lose their leaves in the rainy season so you can grow crops underneath because there's no shade. It's a beautiful seasonal sequencing. And that's becoming a very, very big deal. Evergreen agriculture is becoming a really big deal. I love it. We have some systems that integrate livestock with perennials, and the easiest one of these is planned rotational grazing or holistic planned grazing, where you're just moving the animals around with electric fencing in a very particular planned way, paying attention to how the pastures are developing. And compared to just leaving all your animals out all the time, this sort of shocks the grasses, causes them to shed some roots and then resprout very vigorously, and it's a really nice soil building technique, a very aggressive soil building technique that a ton of farmers around here are having really, really good luck with. And farmers all around the world are having really good luck with this. And what I like about it is it uses very appropriate technology. It uses this little portable electric fence with a little solar charger. So it's knowledge intensive, but it's not equipment intensive. And it's a great way to rapidly restore the health of an ecosystem, of a pasture, and to sequester carbon. Again, those animals are making methane, but when you compare them to feedlot animals whose grain is being grown on annual farms far away, so the grain is being grown in a carbon losing system, shipped to the animals in a carbon-losing system, and then those animals are creating methane, that's a very different balance than when they're sequestering carbon and making some methane. To me, that's a very different balance. We also could maybe not eat beef 7 days a week. I hate to say it. Silvopasture is just a combination of trees in the pasture. And those might be trees that feed the animals, they might be trees that feed people, they might be trees for another use, or they might just be there to make shade and maybe nitrogen for the animals underneath them to benefit the pasture and the livestock. And people are also working on perennial grain grazing systems in Australia. The perennial grains are still really coming along. We don't have wheat that can make wheat every year for 5 years yet. But in Australia, they've worked out if we could get it to yield just, I think, 40% as well as annual wheat for 2 years in a row, and then stick around as pasture for a few years, that's economically viable already. So Australia is really leading the world in carbon farming systems. They actually developed a carbon farming policy, a national carbon farming policy, with some really interesting things. So they've been way out ahead of all of us on these issues for a long time, because I think their climate is so much more vulnerable to any disturbance than ours is. They don't have forgiving soils. They don't have forgiving rainfall. Uninhabitable is bad. Yeah, we want to avoid that. We want to avoid that. Still existing but being uninhabitable is still, to me, not what we're aiming for. Thank you. That's great. Then we have some traditional perennial systems like regular sustainable forestry is a great carbon sequestering system. Orchards are great. There's plenty of orchards around here. And then bamboo systems and coppice systems where you cut woody plants and allow them to resprout are marvelous carbon sequestering agriculture systems, which have a tradition on this continent that goes back perhaps 12,000 years and a rich tradition in Europe. But somehow when those two cultures came together, everybody stopped doing it. So we need to get that going again. There's people working on that. In the tropics, we have some very nice integrated perennial systems. There's a tropical home garden, which is really a complex multi-storied system. You have trees and shrubs and vines and fungi and livestock and annual crops all growing together. At my wife's mom's house, they have a tropical home garden. They don't think it's anything fancy at all, but they have, avocados and bananas and cherries, and then there's perennial squashes climbing in those, and underneath they have vegetables, and they have medicinal plants, and they have ornamental plants, and they have things they use to wrap tamales, and they have small livestock like poultry, and then they have their dishwashing area, and all the gray water from the house goes out there too. That's a tropical home garden, and there's millions of them around the world, but it's a very, very interesting system, and that people are working on ramping up and scaling up. One attempt to scale that up is the perennial market garden, which is really very similar in the middle there. This is my friend Roberto's place in Guatemala, where you have rows of trees. He has avocado, macadamia, citrus, mulberry, peach, and so on. And then in rows underneath, he has medicinal plants like aloe. He has cut flowers. He has perennial kale and perennial beans and alfalfa for his chickens. All of those things are marketed in the same place, just 20 minutes away from his house, so he doesn't have to go to 80 different markets. He's going to one market with all of it. And I think this is a model with a real potential for Franklin County. This would be something we could do here now. Then the last one is the plantation polycultures. In this case, again, we have nitrogen-fixing trees with coffee underneath. We really don't have a good substitute for coffee here, but the shade crops here, the high-value shade crops here would be things like ginseng, golden seal, ramps, toothwort, which is our native wasabi, which is really wonderful, mushrooms, things like that. Some seed crops as well. And then there's some new perennial polyculture systems being developed for cold climates, which is really fun. Let's see, starting in the middle, the oldest one of these is the Land Institute's work on developing a perennial prairie. They're trying to figure out how to have grasses and legumes and sunflower family species like the prairie, but have each of them making food and growing together in a polyculture like the prairie to have all the soil building instead of soil destroying benefits to the prairie, because our annual agriculture systems on the prairie have lost, I don't know, some people say as much as 14 feet of topsoil in some areas. And then that's going out into the Gulf of Mexico and poisoning life in the water. The soil itself and all the excess fertilizers going out into the Gulf of Mexico and killing lots of life there. So they've developed this system initially to address erosion, but it turns out to do a really nice job on carbon sequestration as well. So that's great. And they've got their first new species from their breeding program is in a 30-acre trial now. Intermediate wheatgrass is a new perennial grain that they've been working on. It's still not very impressive in terms of yield, but it's a new grain that can live for 5 years or more and make grain every year, and that's heading in the right direction. Then we have on your right, we have what they call leader follower tree crop silvopasture, which is just a modification of what J. Russell Smith was proposing first 100 years ago this year in his articles. This is the guy who wrote Tree Crops of Permanent Agriculture. He started writing articles about it in Harper's Magazine and Atlantic Monthly in 1913. It's a really, really great system where you integrate trees and livestock. The trees drop some food on the ground for the livestock. The trees are widely spaced, so there's plenty of light for the pasture, and some of the food is for people too. He talks about corn that grows on trees was sort of his vision of what he wanted to see. And this is one of the people doing this work now. It's a guy named Mark Shepard in Wisconsin who recently wrote a book called Restoration Agriculture, where he talks a lot about this as sort of a savanna type ecosystem, where he not only has these different tree species, but he's rotating through lots of different kinds of livestock, one after another. So this one eats that much of the grass, and the next one eats this much, the next one eats only the thistles, and the next one does this. It's very lovely, very sophisticated system, basically taking the Joel Salatin's salad bar beef model and integrating it with tree crops, which is a marvelous, marvelous effort. Some of the numbers in his book are totally wrong, inaccurate, or making the wrong comparison between his system and corn production. He does not get more calories per acre than corn, although he claims that he does. I'm hoping he's maybe just bad at math. But he has taken his approach and worked with the university, and they're doing trials. So I completely respect that. And I think what they'll find is it doesn't yield as well as corn, but it's totally great for all these other things, including carbon sequestration and runoff into, capturing more rainfall, but reducing the amount of nutrients that are poisoning the water around it, and blah, blah, blah. It has a million benefits. It's okay if it doesn't produce as well as annual corn. We have to start weaning ourselves off of our dependence on annual corn for our plastic, for our ethanol, for our corn syrup. We can keep it for tortillas. That's great. But I think some of those other things we need to get ourselves off of the drip feed. And then the last system, which I really just love to death, is called woody agriculture, and this is being developed by a place called Badger Set Research Farm. And Keith and I went out there a couple of years ago and just had the time of our lives. It's super fascinating. Their goal is to replace corn and soybeans with hazelnuts and chestnuts. And they don't want to see them grown in like orchard style. They're planting them in double rows really close, planting them from seed. I think the rows are like 24 inches apart in the double rows, and then each double row is, 16 or 20 feet apart or something anyway. And they're cut down completely to the ground every 10 years. You take the wood off as a biomass crop, that doubles as pruning. That's the very easy kind of pruning. You cut the whole thing down to the ground. Very easy pruning. You have a biomass crop, and then when it resprouts within a few years, you're getting nuts again because they're actively breeding for very quick nut production. So it's a carbon sequestering system. It's highly perennial. It's completely perennial. They're looking at staple crops for people, which is a really important issue. It's not just about leaves and fruit and stuff, which is what I grow in my forest garden back home, mostly is leaves and fruit. They're really looking at the carbohydrates and fats and protein that people live on. And then they're integrating livestock. They're running pigs to pick up the drop nuts. They're using sheep to graze. They're using poultry for pest control. It's an absolutely beautiful model, and their goal is to see Iowa completely covered in chestnut and hazelnut production. They're doing amazing breeding work, conventional breeding work, not GMO, but very, very sophisticated. Their goal is to get hazelnuts on the cob, among other things. They also have chestnuts with as many as 12 nuts per burr instead of the usual 3 or 4. And I've seen that now in California as well. That's not a... Luther Burbank had apparently done that 100 years ago because I saw some at Burbank's place. So these are very, very exciting developments. And somebody had a question over here, yeah. The chestnuts too, yeah. Cut totally down to the ground every 10 years. So you would do a rotation. You wouldn't cut the whole farm every 10 years. You know, every year you would cut 1/10, I guess, right? So you always have some in production. Totally fascinating, totally fascinating. They have great views. They've even got their hazelnuts set up for machine harvest with blueberry pickers that straddle the row and just sweep them in. Instead of normal hazelnut production, they prune them like trees, and you have to have a shaker that shakes them down and then pick them up underneath. Their system is way faster, way more efficient. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. That's woody agriculture. That'd be a fun thing to do some trials of around here. They have a nursery. They sell the plants. You can buy the plants, try them out. I think it's really cool. And then I want to talk about livestock integration for a minute, which is one of my favorite topics. And this is where I'm so glad that Heifer has stood its own against all the anti-animal agriculture stuff over the years. There's good ways and bad ways to raise animals. And to me, the highest and best way to raise animals is in a way that makes them happy and healthy and reduces labor and reduces the input of fossil fuel machinery and of pesticides and of fertilizers and everything else. When you can integrate livestock thoroughly into what you're doing, everybody wins. So here's my favorite example. This is a little food forest project that my friends have in Mexico, where they've got macadamias and bananas and guavas and, you know, all that good stuff we wish we could grow. And peaches, they have peaches, they're at high elevation. With nitrogen fixing trees, but they couldn't get rid of the pasture. They have the tropical version of quackgrass. They call it Pastoestrella stargrass. You just can't get rid of this stuff. And it was making it impossible then to grow anything underneath. This grass was just choking out everything, and it was even putting too much competition on the trees. So they tried all different kinds of livestock, and what ended up working is they fenced in an acre, and they put geese in, a specific breed, the African wheater geese, that eat grass and clover and nothing else. And within a year, the grass was gone. It was suppressed. The roots were still in there, and it was still sending up some shoots that were getting eaten by the geese. But they could go from 10 geese per acre down to 2 at that point, and then plant out all this stuff underneath, like taro and ginger and sweet potatoes and cassava and turmeric and cardamom and all these other marvelous, marvelous, marvelous things, coffee even. The geese just eat around those things and watch for where the grass is coming up and go for that. And geese can live to be 70 years old. So they don't eat any of their geese. They sell them. They sell their babies to other people who want to implement this system. And I don't know if there must be geese in the heifer system somewhere, right? They must be passing geese along somewhere. This particular breed is one of my I'm dying to get some more land where I can do this myself. I just think it's the most elegant thing I've ever seen. Absolutely beautiful. So this system, the African wheater geese is the breed of geese, and you can get them from Murray McMurray Hatchery. But you want to raise them from the beginning on grass and not feed them, store feed all the time, because they'll become spoiled and lazy. Which I do. Well, that's what happened to me. So, I became lazy. That is about what I eat. So just a few examples of livestock integration. We have all these really fun, and I have articles about this on my website if you like. They can mow and graze. That's a valuable function. They can clear brush. That would be in the initial stages, right, to prep land. They can eat insects. They can till the soil, which again would probably be only in the initial phases. They can weed only grass, that would be that one species, and they can pick up dropped fruit and nuts, which is actually a big deal. It's not just that they make a mess and attract bees and stuff, but a lot of insects, pests, and diseases spend part of their life cycle in that rotten fruit and in those rotten nuts on the ground, or they spend a while there and then they burrow into the soil. So if you can send an animal in to eat those things, they turn the pest problem into manure and meat or milk or eggs. And that's a really beautiful way to integrate livestock. You don't want to leave them in there all the time, but if you rotate them through at the right point, they can make a huge difference in pest control, which I think is really fabulous. So these are just some different kinds of livestock and which things they're good for. The thing is, within each of those species, some breeds are going to be better than others, and the way you raise them from the beginning is going to make a big difference as well. But I think it's quite exciting. Then there's also a bunch of limitations, right? Some of them damage young trees. They either eat them or just step on them and break them. So you need to use tree tubes if you have livestock at that point to protect your trees. Some of them scratch or dig in the soil, like pigs, like chickens, and that's often not desirable either. So you might want to bring those through very briefly or only at certain phases. Some of them really are only compatible with pasture, but a few actually can live with a very diverse, productive understory. Those are the ones really interesting to me. So ducks mostly want to eat bugs and slugs. They don't dig. That's great. Guinea hens, they make a horrible sound, but they taste delicious, and they do a great job. Adults eat, I think, 90% insects, and they don't really scratch. So guinea hens, great example of something that can be integrated in a really diverse system. And then the geese, particularly those African wheater geese would be the other example. I think these are all really lovely things. Now there's food safety issues around manure. You don't want them on your lettuce. You don't want to eat lettuce that has poop on it, right? But there are ways to figure out which crops you integrate them with and what time of year you're bringing them through. And I think that's really the challenge there. Then we have all these other tools, and I'll just say harvesting rainwater is a good idea. Why irrigate when you can just catch the rain? And I go to places, I just got back from Nevada, where the place I was staying has 6 inches of rain a year. It gets as cold as it does. They get 10 degrees below zero. They have a 90-day growing season, and they're growing all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff I grow. Just with rainwater they've harvested coming off of the road and off of their building. And I think, why am I irrigating these things? I'm embarrassed. I'm just embarrassed that I'm irrigating something that they can grow without irrigation in Nevada. That's a sad state of affairs. So I'm learning to think a little better. Like apples in California can go 8 months without rain. Now, big apple farms here don't irrigate, but a lot of home gardeners irrigate their apples. Probably we don't need to do that so much once they're established. Then there's these other tools. There's nitrogen-fixing plants that are making their own fertilizer and helping their neighbors. Organic no-till systems have been worked out on an experimental basis. There's one place that they work now at the Rodale Institute, and other people are learning how to incorporate that system. The timing is really essential, but they have worked out ways to raise annual crops without tilling the soil using this really strange looking device that goes on the front of a tractor or roller crimper that sort of turns the cover crop into mulch without uprooting it, and then plants behind in a no-till planter. And then we have biochar, which is a bit of controversy around the world right now. The short version is it's a special kind of charcoal that can be incorporated in the soil and sequesters carbon for a long time. Initially, it sucks all the nutrients out. So what people are doing is pre-charging it with life and nutrients by mixing it with a compost pile for a couple months before they put it in. And the controversy piece is that people are looking at buying up huge areas in Africa, for example, to do biochar to get carbon credits on the European carbon market, displacing people who've been growing their own food on that land for thousands of years. That's not a good application of these practices. And any of these practices and any of the crops can be done in a horrible way. The African oil palm is a marvelous plant. It's a wonderful plant, which is being grown in a horrible, horrible, horrible way and destroying the planet, destroying people's lives and destroying ecosystems. Sugarcane is actually a really marvelous crop. But it's being used right now in Brazil for ethanol, and people are being convicted of slavery for the horrible treatment of the workers on the sugarcane plantations. That's not what I'm hoping to put out there with these practices, but we need to remember that any of these things can be done badly. They have to work in a social context. So biochar is just one example. Just a couple things about some crops. We're talking about crops that are perennial and aren't killed by harvesting. That's the highest and best carbon potential. And I'm particularly interested in staple crops. There's plenty of fruits and perennial vegetables out there. I feel confident about that for almost any climate. But the protein, the fats, the starch, those are things I'm really trying to look at. And I have an article about that on my website also if you like, and there's a big piece about that in the book. This is buffalo gourd, which overwinters for me in Holyoke just fine. It's a perennial pumpkin seed. It's very high in oil and protein. It's not a beautiful plant. It smells horrible. It has really scratchy leaves. But it can grow in Nevada. It can grow in 6 inches of rain a year with 20 degrees below zero. And that's pretty cool, because there's a lot of places in the world like that, high and dry places. So just a few things that are kind of ready for prime time. In this area, the chestnuts and hazels are some of our best bets. We have some very fine walnuts for this area, grafted varieties of those. And the yellowhorn is a really exciting new nut crop. It's being billed sort of as the macadamia for the north. I'm not that impressed yet, but it's very cool. And it's being grown as an oil crop for an edible oil and a biofuel oil for biodiesel. It would make a very nice bioplastic feedstock as well. I'm interested. I'm intrigued. I haven't eaten one yet. I'm reserving judgment. But we're not just looking at food crops. Part of the job of reducing emissions is to use less fossil fuels. In particular, to use less petroleum is one of the places I'm looking, because we don't use petroleum just for energy, but we make stuff from it. We make plastic from it, and we make rubber from it, and we make pharmaceuticals from it. In fact, 20% of petroleum in the US is used to make chemicals and pharmaceuticals. That's a lot. 10% of that is the raw material, and the other 10% is the energy to make those chemicals. So people first made, everything we made from petroleum, we made from plants first. And I'm looking at the perennial plants we could use to replace petroleum for materials and chemicals. Energy mostly needs to come from clean sources. There's not enough land in the world to grow the amount of energy that we use. We have to have energy from wind and solar and geothermal and all the other things that are being demonstrated right here at GCC. But you can't make plastic from the wind, and you can't make rubber or hydraulic fluid from the wind, and we need those things to have a civilization. I'm a fan of plastic. I'm a fan of hydraulic fluid. I love WD-40. I wouldn't want to live without it. And it turns out you can make WD-40 from a lot of things. We do recycle a lot of plastic, but they're made from petroleum initially. So if you make them from plants and then you reuse them and then finally you recycle them, that's a much, much more positive carbon balance. Very good question. Yes, we need to recycle them too. This goes along with the whole environmental picture. So some of the types of categories, there's biomass crops, starch crops. 17% of European grain production goes to make paper and cardboard. It seems to me like our annual grains should be prioritized for people to eat, not for livestock to eat, especially not for ruminant livestock to eat, and not for cardboard or drywall. We shouldn't be growing corn and making drywall out of it. We can make that out of perennial starches like Osage orange and horse chestnut, and even non-edible perennial starches. Yeah?
What are the plants in the photograph?
In this case, that is a short rotation coppice of willow. There's 9 million acres of that in Sweden, and they're using it mostly for biofuel, but it could be used for all kinds of more interesting things as well. Let's see. So, okay, we need to sort of turn agriculture around with more perennials. We need to do the annuals better, to limit the production of annuals and do it in as best a way as we can. We need to become regionally self-reliant, which basically means we need to stop shipping things around the world, which is scary to think about. We need to shift to smaller scale operations because smaller scale and more intensive operations sequester more carbon and are more productive per acre. We need to dramatically reduce inputs and fossil fuel use. That's a pretty big plan for the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years globally. And there's roles for there's a lot of niches in that ecosystem. You might say there's a role for government and international policies. Mostly our policymakers are failing us on climate change. I'd love to see a consumer certification like organic certification that would certify how much carbon was sequestered in the production and how far it came to market. Like you use your iPhone and you see on the label and it says, well, this was grown on a tree 10,000 miles away. That doesn't actually get a very good score in the end that way, right? Or it was grown on a tree around the corner. That's the best possible score. So if any of you want to do that, let me know and I'll tell you everything I've thought about it and I'll help you go do it and I'll promote it for you. I'm not doing it myself. There's a role for research for colleges and universities, for community colleges. There's a role for social entrepreneurship. There's a role for businesses here. There's a huge role for businesses here. There's a role for lenders. There's a beautiful new book called Raising Dough, which is a guide to creative financing for small food businesses. It's fantastic. And there's a role for citizens. There's an essential role for citizens because without citizens making noise, policymakers won't change what they do. So I'll just give you 2 steps you could take tonight. One is you've already made a donation to Heifer by getting in the door tonight. Think about a bigger one. They're doing the great work. And also think about starting your own carbon farming business. And I'll just throw a few ideas out about what that might mean in the time that we have left. This is my friend's new mobile market in Florida. Some of the challenges to doing this are you're planting plants and you have to wait a long time for them to make you money, especially here in cold climates. You're waiting a long time. That's a challenge. You're usually spending more money figuring out, planting your nitrogen fixing plants as well as your crop plants, figuring out how to integrate your livestock, buying those tree tubes, whatever it is. So there are some extra costs associated. You're also experimenting with sometimes new crops and usually new systems, new production systems, and you're trying to sell weird stuff, which is really hard to do. These are macadamias at my friend's place in Mexico that they can't sell. They're just sitting in sacks in their greenhouse, 50-pound sacks of macadamias because no one there buys macadamias. They don't know what to do with them. I know. We know what to do with it. We love macadamias. They don't want to ship them out of the country. They want a good carbon balance, and they don't have the right processing equipment to move them quickly, to shell them quickly, and they don't have a good local market for them, so they're just sitting there and they're cracking them one at a time with a hammer on a rock. To me, that represents a problem. You could have the greatest crop in the world and grow it really well, and I would say they do have the greatest crop in the world, macadamias, and they do grow really well, but they can't sell them. So that's another layer of challenge. And the budgeting, I do whole big courses and stuff on the budgeting issues here. Doing financial projections for a multi-year, multi-story complex system is much harder to model than this year I'm going to grow corn, next year I'm going to grow soybeans, then I'm going back to core again. It's challenging to make those financial projections, and it's challenging to keep the records on it. It makes it harder as a farm business owner to do. Yeah.
200,000 acres.
Oh, hectare. It's about 2.5 acres. That's what everybody else uses but us. So here's a few examples of big systems. There's tons of people in the US doing black walnuts with annuals and pecans with annuals. That's great. In China, there's a huge amount of paulownia or princess tree grown with wheat, hundreds of thousands of acres. And then jujube, which is a tree that, with luck, global warming will have some benefits and allow us to grow them here, is a fruit tree that's grown in China on a huge scale, intercrop with vegetables. 200,000 hectares is about 500,000 acres, which is, about the size of Western Massachusetts or something, I want to say. I don't know. It's a lot of land. It's really a lot of land. So there are some large-scale examples out there that we can look to, which is great. And I wanted to show just one case study of a smaller, diversified operation. This is in West Virginia, which is not unlike Franklin County in terms of the hilliness and the terrible soil and the oaky-based forest. This place called Walnut Meadows, they have 300 acres of forest land that they manage on a rotation. They do have a timber plantation of black walnut. They have their own sawmill on site. So they do all their own value adding. They have their own sawmill, they have a drying kiln, and then they have a cabinet shop. So they're turning out the very highest dollar product from their lumber. But they also are growing ginseng. After they come through and log out an area, after they thin an area, they plant out ginseng underneath, which is a very high value forest, shade-loving crop. And they're making a ton of money on that. They've even become the nation's leading seller of ginseng seed. And then they sell mushrooms using the waste product of wood that they have from their production system. They raise mushrooms, and they're a very big deal mushroom seller, fresh and dried mushrooms as well. That's a really good example of an integrated family scale business. I think they have 30 or 40 employees. It's great. We could use a number of businesses like this in Western Massachusetts as far as I'm concerned. I'd love to do a field trip down there sometime and see what they're doing. And there's a case study about them in a SARE guide online called The New American Farmer, if you want to read a couple pages about them. You want to figure out what you can produce and what you can sell and have those things fit into a unified marketing plan. Like if you have a farm stand, you probably don't want to sell lumber there. People are going to come to buy apples, they're not going to take home beams, right? But they might buy firewood, or they might buy crafty things or something, right? Direct marketing, you're selling yourself, you're selling at the farmer's market, let's say. You get to keep all the money, but you're doing a lot more work. And you can sell new and weird stuff. Wholesaling, there needs to be an established market. You get a lot less money, but you don't have to spend all the time marketing. So my favorite example is at Nuestros. The market downtown, the supermarket downtown sold cilantro for $1 a bunch. And we could sell it for $1 a bunch at the farmer's market, but we could only sell about 40 bunches a day. We could wholesale it to the supermarket, but they paid us 10 cents a bunch instead of $1 a bunch. So if you have enough volume, that's great. If you have 100 cases, 10 cents a bunch is pretty good. But it depends what scale you're at. So there's reasons to wholesale and there's reasons to direct market. And value adding is where you're processing in some way, whether it's edible or not. You can take garlic and make a garlic braid out of it. You can charge more money for the same garlic. You can take tomatoes, well, let's say strawberries because they're perennial. You can take strawberries and make strawberry fruit leather or strawberry jam and get more money for the same strawberries, but also you get a shelf-stable product because those strawberries aren't going to last very long. They're going to rot really fast and you have to sell them quickly. It's nice to have a little more leeway about when to sell things. But you have more processing and legal challenges. Just these a few of my favorite enterprise ideas. The smoothie stand. This one is in South Florida. This is at the fruit at Robert is here, fruit stand. I know Jono's been there. Is anybody else? There's another one over here. If 3 people in one room have been to a smoothie stand in Florida, you know it's good. It's really good. You can go inside like jackfruit, chocolate pudding fruit, papaya and key lime, please. And they'll make it up for you from local fruit that they have either fresh or in their freezer from their year-round tropical fruit production there. But you could do that here with pawpaws and peaches and strawberries and blueberries. I don't know anybody who has an on-farm smoothie bar in Massachusetts. It would totally work here. Artist charcoal. For a very small willow operation, you could have a willow operation the size of, this piece of the stage right here. Cut them down every year and allow them to resprout, get that nice thin straight wood, cook it in a charcoal cooker and get artist charcoal. Right now, those are selling a little bundle, selling for $12.38 in Europe. That'd be a very small scale operation. And there's a limited market for artist charcoal, but I don't know anybody doing this in the US right now. So it's all yours right now. You go around to artists' supply stores and you go to events like craft fairs and stuff where artists go and you sell your beautiful handcrafted every one slightly unique, every twig slightly unique artist charcoal. That'd be great business. This is our native wasabi. It's called toothwort. Real wasabi sells for $110 a pound. I bet you could get $50 a pound for this one anyway. It's native, it grows in full shade, tastes like wasabi, easy to grow. This would be like a ginseng type shade product for us. Woody cut flowers. You can cut down things like crab apples and red buds and some of the magnolias, allow them to resprout pussy willows, and they make beautiful cut flowers that you can sell, these woody branches. Sometimes you cut them early and you force them. Very high value product. This one is a magnolia, southern magnolia, that a guy outside of Washington, D.C. is growing on one single stump. He sells $1,000 a year of cut flowers. Now, he lives outside of Washington, D.C., where there's fancy restaurants and fancy hotels and fancy weddings. But still, this is a carbon sequestering business idea. Pig roasting. Well, the nice thing about livestock is they can eat the weird stuff, and then you're marketing a product, the meat, that everyone is familiar with. So whereas we were wholesaling our hogs for, I want to say, about 50 cents a pound live weight on the hoof, we could roast that pig and sell it for $10 a pound. And if you only have 10 or 20 pigs, it's a much, 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 much better way to go. Biochar, just as an example of an industrial crop, really if you want to make bioplastic, you're not doing that on your farm. You need a regional scale cooperative to do that. But biochar is selling for $35 for a 5-gallon bucket online. That's something you could just get into on your own. The Small Farm Institute is doing it. There's a guy out near Boston doing it. There's a very untapped market. Eventually that price is going to go down. It's in that sort of like big phase, but get it now and it's still going to be good. I predict that it'll work out to about the price of compost, about $30 a yard. I bet that's where it'll settle down to in the long term, which is still a very, very good business to be in. Seed of native plants. Huge business opportunity. I used to run a seed company. I worked as a seed collector for native plants around here. There's lots of money in these seeds. Some of them are selling for, some sedges sell for $2,000 a pound. Now, if you're wholesaling to this seed company, you might only get $500 a pound. Oh no, that doesn't sound that bad to me. And a lot of these are things, again, that will grow in the shade or that will fix nitrogen. This is New Jersey tea, which is a native that grows in some shade, fixes nitrogen, makes a nice tea, but the seed sells for $600 a pound. That's where the action is on that particular species. So power lines. People are grazing under power lines now instead of, power lines you have to pay somebody to cut down the trees that grow under there so they don't tangle up the power lines, right? Usually those people come in with chainsaws and herbicide. Now they're paying people to come and run their livestock. And the folks at Badger Set who are doing the crazy stuff with chestnuts and hazels are now getting people paid to plant hazelnuts underneath, which never are going to grow more than 15 feet tall in their management system. So having no land to start a farm is hard, and a lot of people are in that situation. When you get paid to farm that piece of land, that's a much better place to start. So this is the category of enterprises that make you think maybe you can make money in farming. That's the category here. So we're looking at these. This is one of those. This is Mark Shepard's farm, the leader, follower, tree crop, silvopasture farm. I think I have, oh, no, there we go. I'll just say briefly that I think there's a lot of potential for this region to do this kind of work in developing these systems. My primary emphasis in terms of my big strategic 10-year plan that I'm in year 4 of is to steer the big climate change money into the work in the tropics, where the systems are developed, where the crops are ready to go, where they have magnificent perennial crops ready to go, where there's more need, where the farming is more subsistence-based, so they don't need to figure out how to sell weird, silly things for a lot of money. But I live here, and this is a big part of the world. We have great carbon sequestering soils. Us and the boreal forests of Canada basically have the best soils in the world for sequestering carbon. We have good organic matter, or we can. We have plenty of rainfall, and we have a nice long winter to slow down decomposition. So we have a marvelous opportunity here, and I think there's a role for us, be we backyard gardeners, seed savers, experimental breeders, or NGOs, schools. There's opportunities to pioneer and experiment with these practices here, the ones that aren't ready for prime time, and also to go full out on the ones. Chestnuts grow here great. Hazelnuts grow here great. Rotational grazing works very well here. So there are some things we could start really going on in a big way, and then there's things that really still need to be played with. So again, there's a lot of different roles for different players in figuring out how to transform the food system. This area has done one of the best jobs in the world of relocalizing production of produce, and we're working on grains and we're working on livestock. But we haven't done a great job of perennializing those things yet, with the exception of the livestock. The livestock aren't perennial, that is, but their pastures are perennial, right? So I'm just been encouraging folks around here to start playing with this. Some of these things really aren't ready for a big farm yet, and I don't want to be promising more than I can deliver. But I think we can take a good square look, assess some of these things, see what's really ready to go and what's still ready to play with. Both of those are very good things. Very, very good things. So with that said, I think we'll say thanks very much.